You're tuned into Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick, and this is episode 98. Mary proves Catholicism is the true ancient path with Rachel Fulton Brown. Guys, before we jump into tonight's riveting episode, just a word about my sponsor, Havana Palace, on Huron Church Road in Windsor, Ontario. For the best service and finest cigars, go see Caesar and Eli. They treat all their customers like family. If you would be so kind as to go to facebook.com/Havana Palace and give their page a like, I would greatly appreciate it. Well, with that said and that out of the way, I have returning guest Rachel Fulton Brown with me tonight. We're going to talk about Mary. Happy feast of Our Lady of the Rosary, Our Lady of Victory. How are you, Rachel, this evening?
I'm good. I'm curious. I need you to tell me why those cigars are so special.
Well, I don't know. I think you can get them. Well, I shouldn't say you can get them anywhere, but they're.
You just said you can only get them from your friends.
They do have.
But what's? I mean, when I was in graduate school and trying to write my dissertation, I smoked cigarettes, and
right.
My guess, and then I quit when I got here, and I was trying to work in the library, and they wouldn't let you smoke, and so I just had to quit. But I'm guessing that smoking a cigar is different from smoking cigarettes.
Yeah, you definitely don't inhale. You'd know immediately if you did by mistake. You'd probably get sick.
All right, don't inhale. But is it then? I mean, I like your prayer because it's like, sending up our prayers like incense, and that my team. I'm just going to hijack this completely. Okay, so. Yeah. My team in the Dragon Common Room are working on our ongoing Christological epic, Draco Alchemicus, which should come into our conversation tonight a little bit. But in Act 2, which we're writing now, they're at a tea party, and we're having them subjected to different spices. That it's a sort of Elizabethan tea party that travels in time and things like that. Okay. And one of the first ones we used was tobacco, because of course tobacco. One shows up in the poem that we're using as our model. It's in the Fairy Queen in Spenser. At least I think Spenser definitely mentions tobacco. Yes, in book 4 or something. And I'm also familially obliged to admit to my terrible ancestry of pirates. Actually, I think it's Sir Walter Raleigh, right? But Drake and Hawkins and stuff like that. So they're bringing it over from the New World, and therefore for the Elizabethans, this tobacco smoke is. I mean, it's interesting because they're in this Protestant mode, but they're also suddenly surrounded by this incense, this aroma of prayer, which is what it was in the North American culture. So I never asked you before. We've done this is like our 4th video together and my 3rd one here. So I want to find out about the tobacco. You got it. Why smokes? Why that smoke? Why not frankincense or maybe not opium, because maybe that's illegal. But
yeah. I started actually 20 years ago. Somebody bought me the Scarface DVD, and I saw Tony Montana smoking Cuban cigars, and I'm like, that looks like, that looks like pretty cool, a lot of fun. So my dad had a humidor full of Cohibas, and I started just picking it up. And I'm 40 now. I started when I was probably 21, and for me at least, it's not the smoke. It's not like I have to, I need nicotine. It's like I go out and have a ritual where I pray the rosary, or I listen to a edifying podcast or YouTube video on the faith or something, and I kind of meditate on the mysteries of Christ or Our Lady. And I don't know, it just helps me relax, and I like the ritual. So that's how I got started.
I'm saying it is a kind of prayer then for you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, because I'm always doing something faith-related while I'm enjoying them, and tonight is no exception. So, yeah.
Well, I'm reassured that this is good. Actually a prayerful exercise. Okay, now do you have questions for me, or shall I just launch into my usual? I can monologue at
Well,
no, I can monologue. That's my job.
You can.
My job is monologuing.
Well, why don't you take us? Okay, so the title, right? Mary proves Catholicism is the true ancient path. That seems kind of verbose and scandalous. Why on earth would we say something like that? What do we mean? Why don't you why don't you start us off? Why such a title? What does that imply?
Well, so I do feel like we've talked about this several times before, and so I'm hoping if you have continuing audience members in the chat right now, they'll let us know when we're not answering the questions we haven't previously. But for this episode particularly, both of us were reading Margaret Barker's new book this
Yep.
summer, The Great Lady. And I mean, I know you've had her on your podcast, and I use her extensively in my Marrying the Art of Prayer, which we can talk about in detail tonight. But the book that she published this summer is like part 2 of the book that she published back in 2012, and my book came in the middle. And so we're kind of in this weaving the threads together. The incense is rising as we pray together. And I think you were asked. Well, one, you were asking me if I was reading her book, and I said yes, of course. And 2, I mean, I've read all of her books, I'm pretty sure. And she's a good writer for those. It's like people who write lots of mystery novels and they have to introduce you to the backstory when they get a new book. If you've never read any Margaret Barker, you can start with any of her books because she's usually rebuilding stuff from previous discussions. But then
repetition.
that there's always a kind of new angle that she hasn't yet dealt with. So there's the temple tradition, which we can talk about. There's the larger question of where the lady fits in the temple tradition. There's what I said in my Marrying the Art of Prayer about how the things that Barker was finding in that temple tradition appear throughout the medieval tradition,
right,
in both the Greek tradition and the Latin tradition. I actually found her work first because I was reading a collection of essays on Byzantium, the Mother of God in Byzantium, and they had one of her articles in there. So, this conversation can have scope as wide as the heavens, which is, of course, the point about Mary, that she is in the Eastern tradition, wider than heaven, and it's her womb held him whom the heavens themselves could not contain. And the problem for Christians now, and I was trying to think of what we could do different this time that maybe we haven't touched on in our previous discussions. One of the huge difficulties that people have now is we're usually in the West, particularly in English, which is why the tobacco stuff in the Elizabethans is relevant. We're usually in the West and in English, coming from a very 19th century obsession with the historical Jesus. And maybe you've had people on that have talked. Have you had people on that have talked through this problem before? Because we could do some of that, because I'm actually teaching a course on the how to read the Gospels, and we started with some stuff on the 19th century historical Jesus. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so.
Okay. Yep. So I'm just going to throw bibliography at your chat, and at your stream. And one is a new book by Meredith Veldman, Veldman. It's The British Jesus, and there are dates in it, right? But the problem is, what did Jesus look like in the literature and art of the Victorians? And she's specifically in the book focused on the Protestants rather than the Catholics. But the Protestants are going to be the one that have had the most effect on the present culture, for reasons which I will now explain. One of the problems is, in the mid-19th century, David Friedrich Strauss comes out with his book, The Life of Christ Critically Examined. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
Okay, I'm just getting territory here. Like I said, I can monologue for you for first interrupt me when it doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, absolutely. So David Friedrich Strauss writes The Life of Christ Critically Examined, and what he proves by way of 3 volumes and excruciating detail is it's all a myth.
Right.
So and it's interesting because he's trying to apply, this is in the 1840s, German historical critical methods to the Gospels, and his main sort of demonstration is how they're so inconsistent. There's no way that you can get an actual, for example, nativity story out of them, because these events couldn't possibly have happened that Luke and Matthew both describe, because the shepherds show up and then they go to the temple, but Matthew says the wise men showed up and then Herod sent them all to kill all the babies and then they fled into Egypt. But when does that happen if they've actually, it's like none of these things, according to Strauss, fit.
Line up,
which, shattered the continental religious psyche in the mid 19th century. That they got very, very upset with this. Strauss lost his job as a professor because they were so. It's like, what do we do with this? Well, over in England, right? They're not reading Strauss in German. They're reading it in the translation that a young woman named Marian Evans made. You may know her by her publication, her pen name, George Eliot. And she does this translation. It's actually behind her novels like Middlemarch, of this crisis of faith, right? You can see it if you've read Middlemarch, where one of her main characters is desperately trying to find the key to all mythologies, and he basically wastes his life doing that because it's this mid 19th century anxiety about, well, wait, we thought Jesus actually became incarnate in history, and we've been spending centuries saying that we in the Protestant tradition are going to find the literal truth of everything and do it historically, and we're not going to invent allegories and mysticisms and stuff like those Catholics. And then here Strauss comes along and says, it's all myth. What's interesting about it is, for the English on their part, they basically just ignore that and double down on the empirical. So they get very attracted to a number of other sources, ironically French and Catholic. But Ernst Renan goes to Palestine in about 20 years after Strauss, and he decides he's going to write a life of Jesus that's based on visiting Palestine and seeing the landscape and imagining himself into what that Oriental mindset in his thinking actually was like. It's rather tragic because his sister goes with him on this journey and she dies in Palestine.
Right.
So he has this longing for telling the truth of the story, wrapped up in the fact that he lost his sister in the midst of researching it, and then spends the rest of his life like revising over and over and over again what he wrote, which is the life of Jesus. And he comes up with the idea that Jesus was, basically a mystical holy man, and that he gets caught up in the delusion that he's son of God. Okay, so now you're in doom, right? On the one hand, you have Strauss saying it's all mythological, none of it's real. And insofar as it's true, it's a myth of like cosmic proportions with tropes and things like that. Renan saying, well, I went there, I studied, and I think, I found the psychology of Jesus, but it still doesn't prove that he's God.
Yeah.
And then you have Victorians still wanting to be Christian and still believing in the divinity. And what they end up with is a sort of visual answers that painters like Henry Holman Hunt and James Tissot they go to Palestine. It's all this very, it's before the photograph, but it's photographic in their desire to make realistic representations of the Holy Land. You are also learning to a certain extent why there's so much obsession to this day with that region in our cultural imagination. And we should, at some point in this stream, do prayers for those who've been killed today.
Definitely.
They're trying to create this again realistic historical representation of what it was all actually like. Now you can imagine the effect that this has on thinking about devotion to Mary as well as Christ, because as we'll talk about it, there's if you're thinking of them primarily as historical figures, there's not much place for the Immaculate Conception,
right?
Or the Assumption, or the resurrection. I don't know. It's interesting. It's like they're peeling away the conviction of doctrinal truth and getting left with nothing but a kind of a sort of sentimentality in one hand. Some of the pictures that Holman Hunt does One of them that's very famous. It's Christ knocking on the door of the heart, and he's like
Mm-hmm.
holding a lantern, and he's in white, and this is like reproduced so many times. It's the most popular picture of Jesus in the 19th century, and they don't have much artistic or cultural capacity at that point to then do all of the kinds of things that we're going to like swim your stream into this evening with, is thinking typologically or thinking
Mm-hmm.
mystically or thinking in the kinds of things Barker has been showing. This kind of realistic empirical representation is translated in the 20th century, unsurprisingly, into first radio. I've been talking a lot about how Dorothy Sayers does this radio play, Man Born to be King. So they, first time in English since the 17th century, they start having a acted Jesus. So he becomes, he's portrayed by a living human being. Although Sayers is theologically adept enough that her characters do actually affirm the divinity. But by the 70s or so, when you have, for example, Jesus Christ Superstar, which my partner in my podcast, the Mosaic Ark, and I, Hiltz and I did a whole episode last week on Jesus Christ Superstar and the problems there, or something like Franco Zeffirelli's television series, through the movies and such like that. All of those are going to be, even as they are trying to show the sort of spiritual reality of Jesus's incarnation as God, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Passion of Christ or something like that. They make it hard to think typologically, I think, because you're watching, actors portraying historical figures.
Yep.
And that is all a long way of saying that's the kind of fog of reality that most modern Christians are coming to. They see Holman Hunt's paintings, they say James Tissot's fully illustrated life of Jesus. A lot of the pictures that if you see on church bulletins or something about, they're historically accurate lives of Jesus pictures, they're James Tissot's watercolors. The movies, the things like that, all of this is going to create this situation where it's saying something like, Mary is realized in the Song of Songs as wisdom makes zero sense.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm.
And I suspect, I mean, I hope it's worth, going through it at that level of detail for people to realize how much your default question is going to be, but how could a Galilean peasant woman be, a virgin mother? And why would you elevate this woman who, I actually thinking about this for a paper I'm writing right now. It's like the usual late 20th century version of things is, well, if we want to understand Mary realistically, we have to say she was probably raped by that Roman soldier that the Talmud says she was raped by, the Pantera, right? And it's like, we've gotten so ground down into this problem of what counts as myth and what counts as history that we can't think in theological realities effectively anymore.
Yeah, typological readings and such. Yeah.
Right.
So what I want to do is, instead of starting from the root in the beginning, which is the temple tradition on how to understand Mary, I want to kind of start at the other end of the spectrum, which is the medieval Christians. So when they read the Psalms, when they read the Old Testament, and I got this sense from your book, there's this idea that, well, the New Testament says so little about her, and so the medieval Christians kind of had to sort of invent this idea of how to read Mary throughout the scriptures. It wasn't something that was holistic or something that naturally flowed from how you would read it. So how did medieval Christians understand Mary and when they read the Psalms, when they read the Old Testament?
Well, that's the way you phrase that question is precisely why I did that long introduction. Right. It's like, we think they're making it up.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been the propensity in the modern period. And I'd say, from the 19th century, with that, quest for the historical Jesus and the frustrations that biblical scholarship has created about the New Testament should kind of stand alone as its own historical source. And
Mm-hmm.
even that phrasing, right? The new, I mean, all of this modern scholarship, including in my field in medieval studies, will start with this claim of the Gospels say so little about her, right? And
Yeah.
so we're going to have to figure out how Christianity invented this cult, and that is literally the opposite of what the medieval tradition says, and it's what Margaret and I have been trying to show people. If you put to one side the lens through which we're reading now, which is very, very difficult for people because we're so habituated to that historical critical realism, right?
Yep.
It's a social realism of, if you want to know who Jesus really, okay, there is a social realism to it, but we need to start over in how we imagine what that means. And the primary thing that Barker tried to show was, we've got the picture of what the actual situation in Jesus's lifetime was for the way in which early Christians describe Jesus. To understand Mary correctly, you do need to understand Jesus, but it's also vice versa. To understand Jesus correctly, you need to understand Mary. And the problem is that we always start with this premise, like Renan did, that, well, Jesus was this guy, and he kind of shows up out of nowhere. He's in this, I mean, Renan's writing in the 19th century, and the Europeans are full of themselves as, sophisticated and civilized, and these Orientals that they're finding in the old Ottoman Empire are, crude and barbaric. And even in Jesus Christ Superstar, there's this great line about, why'd you pick such a backward land in such a strange time to become incarnate? Like, as if Jerusalem in the first century is nowhere. It's like projecting the modern European Orientalism onto Roman Palestine, which is nonsense. In Roman Palestine, the reason they're fighting over it was it's the center of the world.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It may feel remote. I mean, it's the center of the world now, right? It's like, it's still the center of the world. And the 19th century tries to tell itself this story that London is the center of the world, or maybe Paris. I don't know, Berlin. And they are then, and they also then have to imagine, as Renan did, they're not sophisticated Parisians in first century Palestine. They're, Oriental holy men who, do weird mystical things and are a bit nuts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right? And if you start from that question of, like, how does our vision of this person in that historic reality come to be seen as God, you end up with a completely different answer than if you recognize the way Barker and I've been trying to show it is, there is a structure of expectation already there that the early Christians understand Jesus to have fulfilled. And that structure of expectation includes the mother of the Lord as a significant figure. So I'll answer your question in a bit about how the medieval Christians read the songs, because I thought maybe it would help your stream to have some example of what I'm saying by this. But the huge question is this giant frame problem, right? Are you going to start from the premise of our historical vision now, which is secularist, materialist, evolutionary, right? If you start from our position in our own mythology of science, in the kind of modern technical mechanistic sense, none of what we're going to be saying will make any sense.
Yeah. And KC says and asks, is this why so many Protestants dismiss Mary, because they reject the miraculous?
They reject Protestants. So we'll start with the Elizabethans in the 16th century, right? So I said with well, maybe go back in time this way, right? With the 19th century, they're working against this German scholarship, but of course that's coming out of centuries of the Reformation, which started with the humanists in the 16th century wanting to get the text right, because they're editing Greco-Roman texts, a lot of Greek texts. Plato come over from Constantinople when the Ottomans. Oh, actually, this is the feast of when the Holy League defeats the Ottomans in 1570 by praying the
Yeah,
Rosary, right? Well,
that's right.
they have to be defeating the Ottomans in 1570 because the Ottomans took Constantinople in 1453, and in the process of that conquest, a lot of many of the scholars from the Greek world fled to Rome.
Hmm.
And so the Italians suddenly have access to all these manuscripts, and they're very excited to be reading Greek intensively. And they think that they're finding better Latin manuscripts, except for what they're finding is medieval Carolingian copies, and then thinking that the Carolingian scripts that the monks invent in the 8th and 9th century are the true Roman script, which is why we call Times New Roman,
Oh,
right?
okay.
The Carolingians think that the Italian humanists think that the Carolingian script is Roman, but it's not. It's
Mm,
Frankish. It's Carolingian. Anyway, and in the midst of all of that, the humanists like Erasmus and others start re-editing the scriptures.
right.
And what they think they want when they're re-editing the scriptures is the best text, right? Because that's what they think they're doing. They get the Plato, and they get the ancient Cicero copied in the 9th century, but whatever. And so what they do is they go talk to the rabbis who have their Hebrew text. But there's kind of a catch,
Mm,
right? Because the text that the rabbis have, the Masoretic text, the earliest manuscripts we have from that, they're about the same age as that Carolingian script. They're actually
mm,
medieval. They're from the 8th or 9th century, right? And of course, that's 800 years after Christ. So that's 800 years of revisions, adaptions,
mm,
commentary, which is what the long Talmudic tradition is,
right.
commentary proving that Jesus isn't Christ. So you have the humanists thinking they're finding the ancient Hebrew, saying, "Oh, look, this Vulgate that we've been using, this Latin text that we've been using all these centuries is wrong because it claims all these things." And I mean, the differences are subtle, and Barker goes into a lot of them very specifically. That if you read in the Septuagint, the actual ancient Greek text
Hmm.
of the Old Testament, you find that the early Christian claims that the rabbis were changing things are at least they're borne out by both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint. So
Yeah, yeah.
maybe they were. And the Protestants come along and they say, well, you've made up all these things, right? You've made up Mary. You've made up well, Mary mainly.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that it's I mean that I what I say, and this will get to our premise in our headline, is why Mary, the Catholic Mary, is the proof of Christianity.
Yeah.
It's without Mary, you can't see Christ's divinity. It's invisible to you. And you could say that's one of the things that's happened in the Protestant scholarship over the centuries is there've been progressive loss of that sense of Christ's divinity, so much so that you end up with Renan and Strauss in the 19th century basically denying either his historicity or his divinity. And there's also falling away of meditation on the Trinity
Mm,
that happens in modernity. But it comes out of this desire in the 16th century to read these texts, and then they start reading them, in fact, from a rabbinic perspective, which
hmm.
wipes out all sorts of things, including the texts in the Septuagint that there are no Hebrew versions of, very specifically the primary text of the Marian devotion, the text about wisdom.
Yeah. So let's talk about that a bit. So, um, Mary as wisdom. Where are we getting this from? I mean, it's common to read. People say, "Oh, I read the Old Testament and I see Christ on every page," but it was commonplace for medieval Christians to say the same about the Mother of the Lord. Like, yes, I see Christ all over the Psalms, for example, but I also see wherever the Lord is, His mother is as well. This is foreign to a lot of people, Protestants especially, but even some Catholics. They're probably not looking to the Old Testament to see Mary in wisdom text. I mean, it's common to read Proverbs 8, for example, and see that I was with the Lord at the beginning of creation. You're assuming it's talking about Christ and only Christ, but how does Mary fit into this ancient religious schema? So if we're looking at let's say the old Israelite religion, the most ancient strand of the Israelite religion in Solomon's temple, we know that Christ is seen as divine because he's the fulfillment of the high priest and the sacrificial system, but also he's the Davidic king, and the Davidic king was anointed as Emmanuel. So in some sense, he's divinized and God with his people. This is all kind of, I don't want to say commonplace, but it's easy to see Christ in that way. It's become more easy to see Christ in that way. But where does the mother of the Lord fit into this sort of ancient path before quote unquote Judaism comes along, or rabbinic Judaism comes along and cleans up the picture? What kind of milieu are we looking at here?
Well, that's what Barker is trying to describe. And so she's pretty controversial because, I mean, primarily I think because she makes the case that Christianity is actually the ancient temple tradition. And if you're at all, if anyone's at all anxious with that claim, say Christianity's true, which
Yeah.
I do think a lot of Christians, they sort of bracket it, right? It's like, well, you have your truth and I have mine, and the Jews, they claim theirs is truth, and the Muslims, they claim theirs is truth, and how can you say yours is truth? It's like, well, we have to, otherwise we can't think clearly, which is a major problem, right? It's like there's always this thing, well, no, you can't actually hold these two things as simultaneously true and not be nuts.
Yeah.
That historically, this is why the age of the manuscripts is all significant to sort of calm things down. It's saying, look, the Hebrew version that we have comes from the Talmudic period.
Right.
The Talmudic period goes from oral to written during the early Christian period, right? So it's saying the Talmud and the New Testament are like siblings.
Mm-hmm.
One is a commentary and then the New Testament and the patristics, right? Because the Talmud's actually more contemporary with the patristics, not the New Testament.
Right.
That the New Testament is reading the ancient tradition one way and insisting Jesus is the Christ, which fundamentally you're saying, and I think maybe it's because you've gotten comfortable on your stream talking about this. Jesus is the Christ. Okay, what does that mean, right?
Yeah.
And it is true that for Protestants, because John Calvin was still caught up in this, seeing Christ in the Old Testament is not impossible. It's I think, but the thing is, I think for some Christians it really is, because they don't see Christianity as the fulfillment of the Old Testament. They see the Old Testament actually belongs to the Jews, and then they apologize that the Christians appropriated it.
Yeah.
This is I mean, it's a default modern position of Christians to say, well, Christianity appropriated and reinterpreted and changed it. It's like,
Yes.
what you have, and I know you and I have talked about this before because it's the basic thing that we always have to recur to. What you have are competing traditions of interpretation. They're in competition. They're literally in competition. And that's why they say nasty things about each other.
Yeah.
Because guess what? People in competition sometimes say nasty things about each other. See the current political situation. So, right, it's like Democrats and Republicans are demons according to each other. Yes.
Right.
So Christians and Jews have tended to disagree with each other because they are, quite frankly, disagreeing on whether Jesus was the Christ. And that's their disagreement, whether he was the Christ. Now, the ancient tradition says there's a Messiah, he's going to come, there's these prophecies. Barker talks a lot about how the Christians' expectation of the timeline comes from Daniel and the apocalyptic weeks and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So the Christians are showing that there is this fulfillment, and the rabbis, and you can see them in the New Testament, right? Jesus is arguing with them, the Pharisees, who are the rabbis, and the Sadducees, who are the priests. And they're saying, who do you say you are? And he tells them, and they have him killed because they don't agree on this then is the real challenge for Barker, is saying there was this ancient tradition that had these features. And I think maybe your questions that you're asking me, you'd rather talk about that. So I got her book too, right? I got both books. I can do either.
Perfect.
that she's saying we haven't seen the old tradition clearly, which therefore makes Christianity seem like it comes out of nowhere.
Yes.
Because we can't see the old tradition clearly, because we accept the rabbinic version of what the old tradition was and say, therefore, the Christian one's wrong. But recognize that's you're within a competing historiography of their own tradition, and both strands are truly, descendants of the same ancient tradition, but they take different elements of it as proof that they're right.
Yeah. And I just want to interject real quick. It's funny because this is the default position in scholarship, that Christianity came out of Second Temple Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism, sort of like a mishmash, and it was a sect of Judaism. But what you're arguing and what Barker is arguing, that no, the roots of Christianity actually go back to the older faith, to the First Temple. And there was several distinguishing features of that system, and one of which was the mother of the Lord, and
Right.
you could not separate the mother from the son. So if we're looking to, I don't know, sort of not reconstruct the past, but rediscover the past, and we want to figure out where does Christianity get this view of Mary? And obviously Christ is the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, but Mary is too. So where does the mother fit into the old religion of Israel, and why is she neglected, and why is she important?
So the why is she neglected, I think, is interesting, because why wouldn't you want to have this vision of your Lord incarnate? I mean,
Hmm.
and I do think the anxiety around whether Jesus was who he said he was is huge, right? I mean, there is, frankly, solving this scholarly problem is a question of faith.
Right.
I mean, you can do all the textual study you want. They're arguing from the same text.
Yeah.
And one says one thing and one says the other, and the the test for the early Christians, the early Christians are reading the Septuagint, which is the same text that the Pharisees are using. Paul was a Pharisee, and he's quoting it.
Yeah.
So they're coming from their reading of the scriptures and saying, yes, Jesus fulfills all these things. What I quite bluntly say about Mary is, you can't. It's like saying that the Gospels say so little about Mary is like saying the Gospels don't tell us about Jesus's childhood. It's like the Gospels are telling us things that matter to the proof of their argument,
Hmm.
and if Mary is in them at all, somehow the mother of the Lord matters to the proof of the argument. That's it, right? It's like
Hmm.
if the fact of the lady being the mother, showing the Christ to the world didn't matter, Luke wouldn't have put it in there. John wouldn't say anything about it. So, try to flip it around instead of saying, why is there so little? Say, why is anything there? Why do any of the Gospels mention the mother? Mark doesn't. And I've just been rereading my Professor Werner Kelber's essay on the story in Mark, and saying Mark is written after the fall of the temple for Galilean Christians to console them at the fact that the family, the apostles, like everybody, Jerusalem itself, the temple, they're all irrelevant to Christ
Hmm.
because they're all gone, right?
Yeah.
He's in at post 70, the Romans have destroyed the temple, and so what Mark comes to is saying, well, that was all irrelevant. What really mattered is that Peter and the apostles, they kept thinking it was about glory, but when it's actually about the crucifixion, and we need to focus on that. So, and that therefore that's the straightforward answer to why in Mark Jesus seems to dismiss his mother. He
Hmm.
dismisses like the temple, Peter, everybody else, right? So
Right.
then you end up with the problem: why doesn't Luke dismiss them all? Why doesn't John dismiss them all? They clearly don't. Why doesn't Matthew dismiss them all? You've got different visions of how to prove that Jesus was the Christ. And in Luke and particularly Luke and John, the mother's presence is critical. So
Mhm.
if we can start there, then we start hopefully find that common ground that the Protestants can accept because they like the fact of the Gospels. saying, okay, we need these gospels. We need to prove, stick with the gospels. Okay, why is Mary there in the gospels at all? Right. I recognize I'm not answering the questions you're asking directly, because I've been practicing trying to get people onto this question, this understanding for a while. I explained to you when we were talking about this episode, I did not succeed in marrying the art of prayer to the extent that academia accepted it. They decided that I wasn't doing history anymore. I was doing this sort of mystical thing. And I'm like, okay, let's try again. Right. Because this exercise literally requires you to flip your head inside out.
Yeah, for sure.
You cannot see any of the story that we've been working with as Christians in modernity as your starting place. And that's obviously very difficult for people, because it means their reality shatters. Now, to think that, in fact, that's what Christianity is about, then maybe it's like, if you're converting to Christianity, you're suddenly seeing yourself in this story that now transforms the world so that you can see it as a creature, into which its creator entered through his mother as temple, blah, blah, blah. All right. All of that. Right. But if you're stuck in the search for historical Jesus and how did the early Christians invent all of this humoristically out of Mary and Jesus, you'll never understand what Dustin has just been saying about the temple. It won't make any sense to you. You'll just, and I found that it's like what the number of times I've just tried to describe this to colleagues, either, they can be secular, they can be Jewish, they can be secular Jews, they can be, Protestants. If you don't find a place where they can start seeing even a little tiny glimmer of this reality, they don't think you've said anything. You're like barking, right? It's like, or you're just like, you're describing something that they're just going, I can't see, which is, of course, what wisdom says is going to happen with those who don't have her. They'll be blind. And I've experienced trying to describe this to people who are blind in these terms, and they think I'm making it up. They think Barker's making everything up. There's no way you can actually prove this. So, what Barker tries to do is over and over and over again, go through all the scriptures and show how they've been read, particularly in the Dead Sea Scrolls context, particularly in this context, particularly. But if you don't understand your own frame to start with, you need to be like hobbits, right? And have Tom Bombadil explain stuff to you. You cannot get from the Shire to Mordor or, even Rivendell without some reformulation of the way you've thought about the question.
So when we talk about the ancient path and we talk about the mother or the lady or wisdom, it's commonplace to obviously, and this comes from scripture, associate wisdom with Christ, being the word of the Father from before all ages. I was actually reading your book and you alluded to this question. I'm just going to pull it up here. So here I'm gonna read a couple of portions just real quick, to situate everything. Okay. So you say here, likewise, Proclus suggested that through the complexity woven imagery of his homilies, the Virgin Theotokos, Lady Wisdom, clothed the high priest, the Word of God, in the elements of creation when she wove the fabric of his fleshly garment in the loom of her virginal womb. Okay, so obviously, as the high priest vests himself in the elements of creation, hence the purple robe, the wind, air, fire, water, hence the purple, the elements of matter and creation. He goes into the Holy of Holies as this a typos of the incarnation right there in the Jewish religion and ritual. We see Mary, likewise, through her participation with the Holy Spirit, weaving the veil of Christ's flesh so that he can enter the world. That's pretty clear. We can get on board with that pretty easily. But then you say here, his mother, she had been with him at the creation of the world, just as he was with the Father. So that raised my eyebrows a little bit. So we talk about Christ being with the Father before creation and from eternity, but there's a sense in which we can say that his mother was also there in eternity. And now, how do we square that without making Mary some kind of member of the Trinity or goddess or divinity. How should we understand that?
You desperately want to have the Protestant argument, don't you? Have I given you all the pieces? Okay, Protestants think in terms of the historical Jesus.
Yeah.
One. Protestants and Jews think in terms of the scriptures that we have from the Talmudic tradition
Right.
because of the rejection of Jesus as Christ. Early Christians are thinking in terms of the Septuagint, which includes these passages from the wisdom literature, which describes, I mean, the before all time element is in Proverbs, right?
Yes.
I was with you at the beginning. And the question you're asking, it's either it's easy to answer if you believe that, and it's impossible to answer if you believe none of those things. So I need you to rephrase that question.
Okay, so if Christ is eternally the second person of the Trinity in the bosom of the Father, he existed before all ages. And that, I mean, early Christians, the fathers, would quote verses like that from Proverbs. I was with you at the beginning of creation, against the contra the Arians, right? To say that, you know, Christ is divine, he's fully God, he's not a creature, hence he's with God from before the foundation of the world. But Barker and you in your book, echoing Barker and obviously confirming what she says, and the church, let's not forget, this isn't something that you made up. This isn't something that Barker made up. This is in liturgically, this is how we read Proverbs 8 for some feasts, and it's also in the little office of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She's
right,
the
and it's
speaker.
also in the it's the exposition of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. So,
Right, exactly.
right,
So I guess my question would be, how can it be that Mary is with Christ as Christ is with the Father from before the foundation of the world, and she not be divine like Christ is divine? Like, how can it be said that she's with God from before the foundation of the world, and how can she be the speaker in Proverbs 8 and Ecclesiasticus, Sirach, when it is also applied to her feast? I came forth as a breath from the Most High. That's also in some of her feasts that
right,
is read, right?
right.
So how do we understand that? How do we place Mary in that sort of mystical cosmological framework without making her a deity or a member of the Trinity?
Right. See, my mind's collapsing because you just changed the terms of the entire argument. Right. Shall we talk about whether or not anybody believes in the Trinity?
Yeah, we can start there.
Because that I said that one of the effects of all of this is that modern Christians don't know how to think about the Trinity either. Right. The
Hmm.
standard online debates that I've been in have, first they sneer, first you start the filioque drumbeat.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
And then the second thing you start doing is saying that, that's ridiculous. How can God, Jesus pray to himself in the garden when he's praying to the Father,
right.
right? And so let me take it in the steps that I would take it, because
Okay, please.
I think the way you've set it up is the way we keep getting trapped.
Okay, please.
Yeah. Okay. So bluntly what Barker does, and I think it's interesting. One of the things she does not do is say where any of this comes from.
Mm,
And I do have this is a sort of the historian in me. One, I was enchanted that she takes it back as far as she does, but you realize she takes it back to the early temple, and she's trying to describe the early temple, and you're just like, how do they know anything?
hmm.
Right? It's it's like saying, it's 1000 BC. Fine, I don't think that's the origin of everything. It's like the world doesn't come into being in the minute that David builds the temple. Although in sort of temple cosmology, it sort of does, since the temple in this
Yeah,
ancient mythological thing is a representation of the heavens and earth, right? That the outer
creation.
the
Yeah,
outer the outer enclosure is the earth, and the interior is the Holy of Holies. And that Barker does this lovely thing, how the Holy of Holies is meant to be day one, right, at
yeah,
creation. So you're wondering, how is Our Lady there with God in creation, right? In day one, in that moment. Um that that I'd say bluntly, the reason that Barker is going to be terrifying to people is she's basically describing the ancient temple tradition as fitting in with the rest of the Middle East.
mm,
that the way she's describing the temples, I mean, one of the great commentators she uses a lot is Philo, who is contemporary with Jesus. He's in
Yeah.
Alexandria. He's Jewish and priestly, I think,
Yeah, it
but
was a
he's not in
priestly
Jerusalem.
family.
He's not in
Yeah.
Jerusalem. So he's in Alexandria and he's writing these grand allegories, which I still need to read more of. But the early Christians really like him. Like Origin of Alexandria is going to be in Alexandria. And
Yeah.
so they're all going to be in the habit of reading these mythologies. Well, Egypt, let's think about Egypt for a second and what its temples look like.
Mm.
And then you realize that to a large extent, what Solomon's temple was historically is a temple, right? It's got the outer enclosure, it's got the columns, it's got the inner, it's got the sacrificial space with the bronze sea for the washing and the sacrifices for killing the animals, and you bleed them, and then the waters. What was I reading recently? Oh, something on the Dead Sea Scrolls. How the there had to be streams coming down, streams of living blood coming down off this Temple Mount to wash away all the blood from all those sacrifices every day, right? It's like when they said animal sacrifices, they meant it slaughterhouse,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And the Holy of Holies in this architecture is the space where only the high priest goes. Although I have questions because like somebody had to build it, right?
Right.
And
Right.
yeah, so but only the high priest goes in. When he does go in, it's filled with all this incense. And if you know, like your tobacco, right? If you know anything about
Mhm.
incense, it's psychotropic, particularly frankincense. Um,
Yeah.
apparently
True.
altar boys can have a little bit, get a little bit too much of it and get addicted to the fragrance. So there is a power in that incense. There's a power in the music that the Levitical musicians are playing and
Mhm.
singing the Psalms. Barker uses this a lot to say it's like music brings forth creation and so forth. So
Yeah. Yeah.
think of when they have these sacrifices, they're burning buckets of incense. There's incense billowing out of the Holy of Holies, and everybody's slightly high because they're singing and they've got this looks like a regular temple, frankly,
Mhm. Mhm.
in that the Middle Eastern tradition of sacred space, interior, peoples where they have a priesthood. Now one of the books that I recommend reading if you want to have some vision of how this works in the ancient Hebrew tradition, that it's not Barker, but it's a classic, is Mo Winkle's the Psalms in Israel's Worship,
Mhm.
where he shows that the Psalms are actually carrying a lot of description of this kind of sacrificial practice, including the ones that she points to and that medieval Christians point to a lot as showing the incarnation as the Son, right? The anointed Son, Psalm 2 and Psalm 109, where the Son, the Lord, is anointed and given birth. Now, what Barker would say is that birthing is in the temple, right? It's
Mhm.
and again, everybody's going to be shocked and you're going to be horrified because you're going to have to see this. What were pharaohs?
Gods.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's saying what I think Barker is bluntly saying is the Solomonic kingship had that character, right? They're
Yeah.
anointed and they become divine.
Right. The type of theosis there. Yeah.
It's a type of theosis there. Now, but the claim of the Messiah is, of course, wanting another of these kings. The anointing that Jesus has, and in Mark, it's I was just rereading about that, right? He's anointed not for kingship but for his death. But anointing, and the anointing oils also had psychotropic properties. If you think about baptism, it's like making the X on our foreheads.
Right.
I'm
Mhm.
now terrified that Elon Musk renamed his platform X. Like what? Because that's actually Barker talks about that the sign of the name is a tau. It's an
Cross.
X,
Yeah.
right? It's not this, it's this. So you're marked with the name with chrism, right? Which
Yep.
also, if it's powerful enough and mixed correctly, will have a blessing effect. All of that's happening in this ancient temple tradition. And of course, if you describe it that way, people wedded to the idea that the ancient Israelite tradition was monotheistic are going to have a few problems.
Somebody just said, I got to cut in here for a second. you get them from time to time. They pop up. Catholics are. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be. I don't mean to laugh, because the person obviously is sincere and believes this, but the person says Catholics are idol worshippers of Mary and of dead priests. Okay, well that's why we're doing this, right? We're trying to unpack
We'll never reach them. They're blind,
yeah.
right? Maybe they'll
Sorry.
stick around and learn a bit of history. Okay, so this temple tradition, if you know Christ, right? I do actually have a long tradition like that. Why did you read that? Now I'm off my game, because that's an old argument. You're Jewish. Thank you. You've just rejected our Lord. Good job. Um, commentator. Okay, so the Lord in the temple that Barker is describing is this anointed king.
Yeah.
And he's described as that in the Psalms. In Psalm 2, as to this day, or no, which one is it? It's in 109, it's this day I've begotten thee, right?
Yeah.
So it's the anointing that makes him Lord. And then she says, it's interesting that Solomon is recognized as king and Lord. You could see that in the Jewish rejection of Jesus as the Messiah is precisely because he's not like particularly triumphal. He's humiliated and crucified, and what they wanted was a warlord who would help them beat the Romans, right?
Yeah.
They wanted a king, like the king in the fashion of the Davidic king or the Solomonic king. Now, one of the other interesting features, of course, of the Davidic and Solomonic kingship is they are accompanied in their throne rooms by their mother. Bathsheba is Solomon's mother. And the mothers in Chronicles particularly stand by the throne, right? And
Right.
Again, if you know anything about it, like Egyptian iconography of the pharaohs, they're often coupled. They have it's their wife, but in this well, frankly, polygamous situation, it's the mother of the Lord that is the one who defines him as the king. There, bluntly, is why you need the mother. She vouches.
Yeah. And there's
I took you from one historical problem to another.
Yeah, there's what does Barker say? There's archaeological evidence of there's a king with basically the throne has two seats. There's one for him and one for his mother. And when Bathsheba comes into court, he bows low and reverences her, right?
And seats her beside him.
Yeah.
Right.
And she's an intercessor for the people of God on behalf of the king. And he the person who intercedes, I forget his name, but it's basically if you ask anything of me, meaning the mother, he will not refuse me.
Right.
So if we ask anything of Mary and she's always in tune and in line with the will of God, he will not refuse her, because her will is God's will. So, I mean, she is the mother of the Lord. And we know that the Davidic king was seen as Lord. And Barker brings us up, one of his titles was Emmanuel, God with us. That's one of the things that Christ fulfills, right? But we know from the Psalms, particularly we can see in Psalm 45, God says to Solomon, "Your throne, O God, is forever." So Solomon is called God. And in that same string of verses, we have reference to the Queen Mother. So we have the Queen Mother in the Old Testament, whose son is also called God. So there's an interesting sort of tie-in with, how the New Testament fulfills the mother and the Lord. And it says in Psalm 45, you're speaking of the Queen, your princes will reign forever, and your name will be praised forever. And in the Magnificat, Mary is saying, all generations will call me blessed. That's not just a spontaneous ejaculatory phrase of, oh, this, everyone's going to bless me now because I'm giving birth to the Messiah. It shows her awareness of who she is. She's hearkening back to Psalm 45, and she'll be blessed forever because she's the mother of the King, who was also the Lord. But rather than being the Lord in a typological sense or in a certain sense, he is the Lord fully. Now the fullness of time has come. So there's a very strong ties to the Old Testament here going on.
Okay, so I'm going to keep shattering your historical frame there, because so we've just like horrified everybody in saying, the ancient Israelites worship their kings.
Yeah, yeah, and they did. It's in Chronicles, by the way.
It's there. And that means that they look more like the other ancient traditions.
Hmm.
So if you're doing this like brutally historically accurately, we don't know that Mary said anything, right?
Hmm.
Luke wrote that, or
Luke wrote
somebody,
it. Yeah.
right? So instead of worrying about what Mary herself actually said, that's back with the peasant girl who doesn't, have any reality because she's raped by a Roman and therefore lied that
Mm.
Jesus was the Son of God. Okay, so everybody says you can do this without Mary, fine, but that means you don't believe in Jesus as Lord either. What Luke does in that, and the thing is, Mary, you could certainly say historically, Mary lives with John. She tells him lots of great stuff. The evangelists write it all accurately down. But step back a bit and say the evangelists are making arguments about who Jesus is. And for Luke, his argument depends absolutely on showing that Mary, in being overshadowed by the Holy Spirit and conceiving the Lord, and therefore, you will have the Son of the Most High, that if for Jesus to be God, Son of God, Son of the Most High, his mother needs to have certain kind of characteristics. And that's
Hmm.
what Luke is showing us she has, right? She has, she's overshadowed by the Spirit. It is interesting, of course, that he gives her that, let it be to me, because so that in
Hmm.
the long tradition, that means her consent matters. And then when she goes to Elizabeth, and this, my favorite, I'm sure I've said this in your stream before, but clearly you have audience that have not heard me before, so we'll say it again. Scott Hahn has a very nice reading of these passages in his Hail Holy Queen. And I've seen it around on the internet a lot, so people know this, that when Mary goes to Elizabeth and in Luke, and Elizabeth says to her, "Why should the mother of my Lord come to me?" That's Luke's proof, right? Mary has gone to see Elizabeth, and Elizabeth greets her as the Ark, and then she says the Magnificat.
Mm.
And her saying the Magnificat is Luke's way of saying Mary fulfills all of these things, including being the mother who attests to the Son. And the mother attesting to the Son is there in the Psalms, it's there in the Chronicles, it's there in the conception of what Messiah means. So all of this revolves around proving Jesus is Christ. And interestingly, one of the elements of proving Jesus is Christ is his mother has to have certain characteristics. Now we're still working up. So now we've come
We're
in from
working towards it. Yeah.
we're working towards why I think the medieval Christian tradition is still carrying all of this understanding, which is fractured in the 16th century by the way of these Protestant textual studies, and the rejection of Mary as mother of the Lord eventuates into, in fact, the rejection of Jesus as Lord.
Hmm.
And that's the reason it's so hard for modern Christians to defend themselves at all against the claim that they're wrong about Jesus.
It's interesting that we use the Septuagint for a reason. And I think people often forget that. They just assume that we use the same text that the rabbis use. No, there's a difference. There's a reason why we have a different canon. Um, in fact, the shorter Protestant canon that came to be used by the Protestants was actually the result of uh, Jews in Palestine reacting to Christian claims, and they were using this Septuagint specifically to make claims about Jesus as the Messiah, and that's why
Right.
the Jews of Palestine, or the rabbis, rejected that, and they went with a shorter canon. There's a reason why we use the Septuagint, and the Dead Sea Scrolls actually bear witness to the Septuagint, which is interesting. So the texts that we thought in the Septuagint that we had were only in Greek, we actually found older Hebrew copies that mirror the Greek. So the Greek was actually based
Right.
off of older Hebrew copies. So yeah, we're talking about the ancient religion. We're talking about the ancient religion of Israel, the ancient path, which had obviously the Lord in the temple, the presence of God with his people. But it wasn't just the Lord. The mother was always at his side.
Right.
So
And that's so now we finally, an hour in, have gotten to the place where Barker starts The Great Lady, right?
yes.
Her book that she's trying to say, and I have it open. It's like she has um the list of the things that Josiah did. This is on page 15, right?
Hmm.
That he removed from the temple all the vessels made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the host of heaven. He deposed the idolatrous priests. He brought the Asherah image out of the temple. He broke down the houses of the male prostitutes who were in the temple, where the women wove hangings for the Asherah. He broke down the high places. He defiled the valley east of Jerusalem where there had been human sacrifice. He removed the sun horses from the entrance to the temple, and he burned the chariots of the sun. He broke up the rooftop altars. He broke down the pillars in the Asherim and filled their place with human bones. He desecrated and destroyed the shrine at Bethel and burned its Asherah. And then she goes into explaining how each of those things shows that what Josiah is doing in this purification is driving out what it's not just Barker who has said that this is the more ancient tradition.
Mm.
The tradition of the Lord, who in the proper nomenclature carries the name, which is the holy name, which is unpronounceable, which Christians say, or Protestants say, Yahweh.
Yeah.
That the Lord Yahweh was there in his temple with his Asherah, and there's archaeological evidence for that, the existence of that figure, the Asherah,
Yes.
whatever it was or she was, and that it's the Asherah as a tree and a pillar. I mean, in The Great Lady, Barker goes into how this is revealed in Christian understanding and revelation, literally revealed as the woman clothed with the sun, so
Hmm.
that the Asher was in fact a sun deity. Women clothed with the sun and crowned with the stars is the return of the lady to the temple in Revelation, and all of the ways in which wisdom is described as things like tree of life,
Hmm.
and the associated with the sun and so forth, return in John's vision of the restored temple. Now,
Right.
it is of course, I think, problematic and disturbing that human sacrifices were apparently made to this deity, but that that you could, your mileage may vary, but you can decide it's like Christ as the sacrifice is obviously a large part of our understanding in
Hmm.
Christianity, and saying that he is the sacrifice of God to himself. Well, okay, there's a human sacrifice which
Yeah.
wipes out all of the animal sacrifices, so we don't have blood pouring down the steps of the temple. Like, I mean, if really, if you imagine how many animals are being sacrificed in the temple in Jesus's day, and it's like, it's a slaughterhouse with streams of blood flowing down those stairs, and they have to wash them off regularly. You might as well be in Apocalypto. It's just not humans.
Yeah. Yeah. I was reading through your book, and I was, reading some of the sources. You referenced the Akathistos hymn, which it coincidentally, it's funny because I think it Saint Germanus who composed that hymn.
No, it's older than that. So again, we're going to get to the things that you're reading for Proclus. You mentioned Proclus.
Mhm.
He's actually in Constantinople in 430, 429, giving that sermon, and that's the occasion. Then becomes the occasion for the Council of Ephesus that
Ephesus, right?
recognizes her title as
Hmm.
Theotokos. Germanus, Andrew of Crete, John of Damascus are some of the great homilists of the 7th, 8th centuries in Constantinople, and their sermons are very important because they show that all of this imagery that Barker is saying is associated with the lady in the temple is there in the Greek Orthodox descriptions of Mary.
Yeah.
And of course the huge question that, just as, where did this Israelite tradition, this Israelite temple worship come from? It could have come from Egypt, right? They could have just carried it out of Egypt with them. It's you've got competition now.
I'm sorry, my kids are entering the studio. Yeah. So I mean,
So there's okay. Let's talk about the really, really difficult unanswered questions. Not whether Catholics are idol worshippers, right?
Right.
Jews think all Christians are idol worshippers. So, join the club. That, and of course, in Barker's description, the ancient Israelites were idol worshippers too. So
Right.
you're in a difficult situation if you want to play purity games. And I will get there. But one, unless you just flat out accept the story of the Old Testament as revelation, you're in a historical difficulty figuring out where this ancient Solomonic temple came from, right? Because we don't know, right? Unless the Old Testament is describing it accurately. The one thing that the Solomonic temple, it just doesn't have a cult idol, but it has the Ark of the Covenant, which in the long tradition will become what Mary is, right? It's the throne of God. Okay, so there's a throne in the temple, and then you have all of the prophecies like Ezekiel and Isaiah seeing a human figure sitting on the throne. Now, is that simply the man who was anointed and he's the king and he's in the midst of the incense, or is it some other revelation of the presence? And if you read Isaiah straight up or you read Ezekiel straight up, there's a human figure sitting on that throne.
Yeah.
Who is that?
Right.
That's a rhetorical question to a certain extent. So there's that one. And then the opposite problem is, okay, so the early Christians are reading all of these prophecies of there's a guy on a throne. That's the one that we want, that's who we're worshiping as Lord. Jesus is this Lord, even though he was this guy from Galilee who got crucified. And somehow in the Orthodox tradition, you start having prayers to the lady, the Subtuum Praesidium. You start having stories about her elevation into heaven very, very early. And everybody in the online prot wars wants to blame Rome. Well, you're going to have to talk to Ephraim the Syrian. You're going to have to talk to the Coptics. You're going to have to talk to the Ethiopian church. You're going to have to talk to the Syrians, the Coptics,
Ethiopians,
the Ethiopians, say in Jez. They're going to have to talk to absolutely every ancient Georgian, Armenian. All of them have stories about her. So it's not a Roman thing. Right. Get over it.
It's not Greco-Roman paganism.
Well, it's not Greco-Roman paganism, but it's not in their fantasy version of it. I'm really mad now because I'm sick of hearing this. It's not some fantasy secret Pope thing.
Right,
okay?
right.
It's Eastern. It's literally the ancient world, all of it. And they all recognize Our Lady as something. And then you get to the Council of Ephesus, and the Protestants want to say, well, it's just Isis or it's just Diana of Ephesians. Consider that the early Christians die rather than throw incense on the braziers for those deities, and tell me that they're going to do that with Our Lady. They're not idol worshipers. They are recognizing the reality of the Lord in his presence. Now, I skipped a few bits because I got mad.
Believe me, I share your frustration, but I think I had a pretty hefty glass of wine, so I think it's taken the edge off a little bit. So I share your frustrations. I get it. I encounter it all the time. I don't engage like I used to, because it's a dime a dozen with these types of claims and folks who parrot them, but they just don't have an understanding of the ancient Near East. They don't have an understanding of the scriptures, the Old Testament, how it fits into the ancient Near Eastern system. I mean, the thing people have to realize is that Christ is the hope of the nations, of course, right? And St. Justin Martyr said, seeds of the Logos, paraphrasing, are basically scattered throughout the world. So in every religious system, every philosophy throughout the world, you're going to find goodness, truth, and beauty that points to Christ, who ultimately fulfills and flowers those seeds and becomes the plant to draw all men into his church and to himself. But there's also types of the mother found throughout all cultures, all religions, all philosophies. So you see Isis in Egypt. It's not to say that this was in zeitgeist. It was a popular claim that Christians just copied pagan deities and imported them onto themselves. No, these female figures are types of Our Lady, the one who is to come. And when she comes, she will purify the errors that preceded her with these cults and systems and bring to light the fullness of truth the same way that Christ does. I mean, that's just how it works.
Well,
So
and what I'm trying to unpack for you is a different way of explaining that,
mhm,
so that we don't get trapped in the same kind of rhetorical straw man that your commentator used. Um, I mean, one way of seeing it is the ancient Israelite temple tradition actually simply participates in all of this mythological thinking in the first place.
mhm,
And that, the Rome Barker does a lot of interesting things, saying that Pythagoras probably visited the temple at the same time as Ezekiel might have been there. And so all
mhm,
of Pythagoras's numerology and measurement and stuff you can see in Ezekiel's worrying about measuring the temple. Okay, so
mhm,
that's cool. I mean, one, what I as a historian, I've always been, I want to understand that Christianity is showing us truth, and what you're making is one kind of philosophical argument. I'm saying, from my perspective, it's like, why this temple, right? Why here?
mhm.
Why did God choose this people
Israel,
and
yeah,
Israel, right? And I think some of it is what I said earlier. It's like it's at the intersection of everything. It's not to say the whole world, has seeds of this reality and therefore they all show up everywhere. It's convergence, right?
yeah,
That there is that, one, to understand they're writing the Septuagint in Greek because of Alexander,
yes,
who conquered that whole region. And so there's lots of, cross discussion and conversation that they're not just seeds, they're like evidence of traditions and contact.
mhm,
And that, you say thinking like God, I don't know, where are you going to plant your temple, the one that you most want people to focus on? Well, you could say everyone's going to got their own temple, like the ancient world, they all have their own deity of the city, and that to a certain extent is what the daughter of Zion is. She's a city deity, right? Like the heavenly Jerusalem that descends as a bride in John
mhm,
is like a city deity, the holy city. And Mary, of course, is the city of God because that's where the Lord is
yeah,
born. But you could say it the ancient Israelite tradition is participating much more in this world, but you could also say it is the model for all of that.
mhm.
I lost the
And
thread of something else you said.
I just wanted to say Kilt's actually joined the stream. So hi Kilt.
Oh, hello, Kilts, help me.
Uh nice to see you. I've watched some of your stuff with Rachel, and it's been great. I love seeing you talk about the Coptic tradition and stuff like that, and I really appreciate it. And David the Good has recently joined the One Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church from Protestantism. So welcome home, David. Good to have
Welcome
you,
home.
brother.
It's
Welcome
the
home.
fullness. It's the
It's the
fullness of
fullness.
revelation.
Yes.
Don't
So
be don't be
yeah,
don't be constricted into this little narrow band of revelation. Draw back the veil and see all of
yeah.
it.
See the heavenly reality. Yeah, like in your book, you were showing how like John of Damascus and other writers liken Mary to just amazing the imagery. The image John of Damascus calls her the image of the Holy Spirit.
Mhm.
The golden altar, the incense, the rod that budded, Aaron's priestly rod.
Right.
Just amazing. Like all these images just show how Mary, she's not divine, obviously, but she brings the divine into the world in fleshed. So without her, you don't have Christ. I mean, not to say out of necessity, God couldn't have come another way, but this is the way he chose for a reason. And if you don't have Mary, you don't have Jesus. And it wasn't forced upon her. She gave her free consent, her fiat.
Right.
So she,
Stop. It's not going to help our argument here if you keep talking about her as a person,
mm,
right?
yeah, you did talk about that in your book. You say,
Because you're falling back into, like, so I'm glad I spent all that time on the earth. You're falling back into thinking of her as a historical figure, which I think she was because Jesus was.
for sure.
But what we're trying to understand is why she has a role in the tradition at all. And
Hmm.
and her reality, her personality, her psychology it's like you read a lot of Chesterton.
I haven't read Chesterton, to be honest with you. All I know is that
That's why we're having trouble.
he said good things about tobacco and red wine and cigar and steak. So I know that quote, but that's about it.
Okay, so the thing I've used this in an essay that I'm working on right now. So like, get it out there to start seeding the world with this thought, right? So we're constantly trying to say, how did this one peasant girl, call forth the Queen of Heaven, right? The throne, right? What we need to do is do the Chestertonian flip. How did the throne call forth the peasant girl? Now, what when we're talking about the reality, and there was something you were saying this before I started correcting you on that, because what I'm just saying is I've been arguing these cul-de-sacs forever, and they're there because of the 19th century empiricism. And the empiricism starts from the wrong place. It makes all sorts of assumptions about text and the way people write, and that we've undone a lot of those. Like, we recognize that the gospel authors are writing for particular audiences and particular things. So sitting there claiming that they're not being good historians because they didn't like sit there with their tape recorder is not using them well as historical sources. And likewise, the sort of mystery of why there is this figure Mary. It's and I was saying, so you were saying this, Jesus could have come into the world some other way. Imagine that.
Yeah.
How? Okay, so in Jesus Christ Superstar, because they have nothing about the nativity in that. The characters in the cast are all on a bus, right? And the bus comes across the desert, overture bus, and the characters getting down on the bus, and they get the cross off, and you see, they're all in street clothes, right? 1970s style. And they get off the bus, and Jesus just appears in the midst of them. Right? So there you go. Jesus just appeared. Now, if you claim, Protestants, that he's the Son of God, which I think you do, I mean, we're going to have to do another thing to get the Jews on board, because we want them to. But if you think if you think he's the Son of God, sure, fine. He's just going to appear out of a crowd, materialize, like he's going to pull all of his atoms together and just go, "I'm here now," like coming down off of the Starship Enterprise, and he's going to materialize. Zing.
Yeah.
Is that going to work?
Yeah. Kilt said I'm surprised she says she has her tobacco lit. Great stream, guys. I didn't know.
No, she doesn't do cigars. I think she does roll ups.
Oh, okay. Nice.
Yeah.
Well,
She's a smoker like I was. You can see me wishing I had some when I'm playing with my fingers. Okay, so one is he gets off the bus, right? So in Drake Alchemicus, and I said our Christological poem, we have him materialize out of a cloud of pigeons. Now, that was on purpose because we're trying to do this kind of mythologically. He materializes out of a cloud of pigeons, which you can see on our website, dragoncommonroom.com, materializing out of the cloud of pigeons, because it's the spirit, right? It's somehow the spirit gives him form, and you could play it off as like the electrical energy of the photons and the waves and stuff coalesces into being a being, and there he is, manifest.
Yeah.
Are we starting to see the problem?
Yeah, definitely. So the medieval Christians then they read Mary into the Psalms not as a historical figure. Not that she wasn't. We're not saying that, but they read her more as a cosmological reality.
Yes.
Right?
Now you've said it. She's a cosmological reality. Right. Now, if the Son of God, the actual Son who's been with the Father before all ages in his bosom, is going to materialize in our reality, he could do it in a temple, a lot of people singing with incense, which is in the ancient, as Barker says, in the ancient tradition, the way they understood that he did.
Right.
That the Lord was there present in his temple because of incense.
Yeah, and music. Yeah.
And music. Right. Now this is where the leap for the Jews becomes difficult, right? Because we're going to say not just that the Lord is present, but that he's taken on flesh. And then you get, thanks be to God, to the true cosmological, truly mythological, never mind Richard Strauss and his Life of Christ critically examined, because he never got to the mythology of how do you imagine that God enters into his creation. Tolkien's better at this than Strauss was, right? How does God enter into his creation? And this is what my Chestertonian, the throne calls forth the peasant girl. How does he enter into the world?
Mm-hmm.
Through his shrine.
Yeah, through his his temple, his throne,
His
you know,
throne.
the cloud on which he rides.
All of those labels, right? And I
Yeah.
do that in chapter 4, right, where I'm going through all of Richard of Saint Laurent's. She's all of these characters from the Old Testament, which is places where she's place, right? Shrine, temple.
Place, yeah.
But the cloud, that's great, right? She's the cloud on which the Lord, or the pillar of fire.
Yeah.
The chariot of the cherubim, which is what the ark shows, right? The Lord enthroned on the cherubim. Mary is the throne, and all of the most ancient iconography. Never mind Rome, people. Look at the Coptic. Look at the Coptic iconography. She's throne.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just like Solomon had.
Yeah, she's throne, she's pillar, and she's burning bush as well. She's the bush that is on fire but not consumed, and in the midst of her is the angel of the Lord, and the bush is the lady out of which he speaks.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, we have, and again, so
and Proclus and his loom, I hope, are starting to make more sense now, right? It's like it's a cosmological reality of what is the incarnation.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. All these things are pointers, and all these things are types of what was to come, i.e. the incarnation. All of these things fulfilled and perfected. I just want to pull up a comment here from Kiltz. Davidic lyre manifests the King of Israel in his Davidic type. Without Miriam, there is no realization of the holy solemnity in the flesh of Christ.
She can take what I say and just like encapsulate it in poetry, which is why we do it in poetry, right? It's like there's you're trying to do this. She did the psalmody, right? The resonance when we did the Christ, our Christ figure coming out of the pigeon cloud. It's also a trilling, the bird singing, right? It's a harmony, and all of now. So now we've gotten to the place turning the world inside out, Chestertonian paradoxes, right? To where you see that we've been asking the questions backwards.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, so did Mary have other children? Well, do other children inhabit the throne of God?
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to do there? Jonathan Pageau is actually really good at talking about this. He's saying that she's a shrine. She's the special place where God became incarnate. If you believe Jesus is the Christ, and you believe the Christ is the Son of God, the Son of the Most High, anointed, with God before you get to the Trinitarian arguments there, you are then bound in a problem of how does he enter into the world? Now, he could show up on a bus, right? But interestingly, even in Jesus Christ Superstar, he's not apparently on the bus. I mean, obviously they put the guy, the flesh and blood guy in the crowd, and they went, woo, and then they saw him, right? But imaginatively, he's not even on the bus. He just appears among them. I did have another example of problem of how he could manifest. He could manifest out of the, how could he come out of the ether, the internet, right? He'd be sort of like a matrix kind of digital. All the digitals come together, and he could like poof, he's there. But we say he was born of a woman. He entered through her into the world, and all of the medieval imagery, all of the medieval meditations are on her as the through, right? She's the gate.
Yeah, she's the gate of heaven. Yeah,
right. And then you realize all of the statues of her. That's what they're showing. Maybe not mine because she's standing and holding him, but the earliest statues are throne of wisdom. He's there. She's framing him. She's heaven. She's like her womb is heaven, like the Holy of Holies, where God becomes present.
Yeah. Oh, that's really beautiful. So I just want to pull up a comment here by Eddie. I don't know if I'll be able to pronounce this author's name, so forgive me. Rachel, can Can you see this? Oh, Eddie, it's my brother. I didn't even realize
Hi, brother.
he changed his name on YouTube. Hey, brother, how's it going? I'm glad you're here. Can you ask Rachel if she's read the book God and Anatomy by Francesca? And I can't pronounce this last name.
Stavrokopoulou.
Okay, so have you read it?
No.
Okay.
Sorry. No. So if you want to know stuff I have read, my book has a very long bibliography. And that in Dragon Common Room, we've been putting up bibliographies for the poetry we've been writing. So there's a lot of places to start there. A lot of what I'm talking from, both in my book and in my reactions to Barker, are medieval texts that I've read. Right. So if you want, this kind of imagery of Mary, and I hope we're to a place now where some of the things that I show in my book hopefully will make sense. For example, the way they read the Psalms. And we could do it. I was thinking one thing, Dustin, might be fun is to read what I say about one of the Psalms, so people get an idea of the flavor
Yeah,
of this
absolutely.
kind of revelation.
Let's do that. Yeah.
But main authors, if you want to know who actually shows this kind of thing, Anselm of Canterbury, saint of the church, famous for his prayer to Christ as the one that gives us the image of the suffering, the why was I not there to see your suffering, and this very affective, lachrymose meditation. But he also, in his prayers to Mary, describes her as the one who you showed to the world its creator, whom it had not seen. Right? It's all this revelation imagery. She is the one who shows, Hildegard of Bingen has the same kind of imagery. She's the crystal, and the light shines through. She shows to the world. In my book, the people that I talk about in most detail include 3 13th century authors who compile all of this imagery. Richard of Saint Laurent, who is he's in Rouen, and has interesting things to say about Jews briefly, but they're in there, where he's saying Mary prays for the Jews and the Saracens. And my colleague in medieval studies, Bill Jordan, has shown that the Saracens that Richard is saying she's praying for are converts from the Holy Land that King Louis brought back with him. Right. So Richard is saying she prays for the Jews. There's a big Jewish community in Rouen when he's writing, and they live right near the cathedral. She prays for the Jews. She prays for the Muslims. She prays for the Christians. And she's all of these different revelation spaces, right? And we've been naming them like mountain and cloud and throne and so forth. I talk about Conrad of Saxony's meditation on the Ave Maria. The Ave Maria is a recognition of this moment of manifestation, right? When Gabriel says, Hail Mary, that's the moment when she conceives. So it's when God enters into his creation, into her, through her. And the last one I talk about is a character called Pseudo Albert, because we don't know who he was. He goes through more scholastic questions about all of these things, but it's all participating in this same, she's filled with wisdom because she's filled with the Lord. Now, you can imagine Jesus, being born in a whore's womb. I don't think you want to do that. I think you understand that God, insofar as and this is the problem of, does God foresee his own action in time? Right. And that goes back to the question you asked at the very beginning, Dustin, is like, how can Mary be with God in all time, in eternity?
Right.
Well, because God knows what he's going to do.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, it's not that hard a question.
Yeah. No,
Once
you're
you
right.
set the problem up correctly, which is the incarnation.
Yeah. So Mary is with God in the sense that since the incarnation of Christ is the telos of all creation and God is outside of time, the mother of the Lord who makes him incarnate is always with him in the mind and plan and providence of God. Therefore, she's with him from before the foundations of the world in his quote unquote mind. So the mother can't be separated from the son. It's a very Franciscan reading, but I think that's how we would understand it.
Right. And it's not that hard a question once you understand the problem of the incarnation. And that's what I say. It's like I did a interview with Patrick Coffin on his Hope is Fuel series, and he wanted to talk about the Immaculate Conception and stuff like that. And like, starting in the wrong place, right? The problem is the incarnation. And then all of the mysteries that we understand about Mary flow from, and that's what Proclus was doing. He was trying to
Yeah.
describe in these sermons what it means to say God became incarnate. And that's why the Theotokos is associated with the mystery of his, you know, I mean, at Ephesus, they're trying to define yet again that he's both human and divine, right? That he's
Hmm.
God and man. And all the medieval devotion to Mary depends on that. And
Hmm.
insofar as people now look at medieval devotion to Mary and say they're over exalting her, it's like saying, you're saying that the shrine where the Lord became incarnate in history was a filthy dump.
Hmm. Or just a vessel.
Or I mean, even is that even meaningful? It's like, I mean,
Yeah.
and the other way is to say, it's not pantheistic, because otherwise you say all creation is his shrine. Um, but all creation is his creature, and she held the creator inside her.
So in a way, she's the matrix of all creation.
Yeah. But it's the absolute, everybody listening, if you get in these arguments, you must start with the incarnation. That's what matters. It
Hmm.
matters to say we recognize Jesus as Lord entering into his own artwork. And Tolkien said it that way, and it's the best way I've ever gotten for people to realize what the problem is.
Yeah. So this whole idea. Okay. So you were going to walk us through the
Oh,
Psalms.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so today's Saturday, and so I thought we could do one of the Psalms from Our Lady's office on Saturday, which for Saturdays in the Roman use is it's Psalm 95, 96, and 97 in the Septuagint numbering, which is the one we're going to use.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I try to say clearly in my book is you have to read the Psalms with the antiphons, because the antiphons are frames, but the antiphons frame in the same way that Mary frames Christ. It's
Mm.
like if you have this interpretive frame, then you see the Lord clearly. So appropriately for this one, the antiphon is, "Rejoice, O Mary, alone thou hast destroyed all heresies throughout the world." And you say, "Oh, horror, horror, she's not the savior. How did she do that?" Well,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
here's the psalm. "Oh, sing unto the Lord a new song. Sing unto the Lord, all the earth. Sing unto the Lord and bless his name. Tell forth his salvation from day to day. Tell forth his glory among the Gentiles, his wonders amongst all peoples. For the Lord is great and highly to be praised. He is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the Gentiles are devils, but the Lord made the heavens. Praise and beauty are before him. Holiness and majesty are in his sanctuary. Bring unto the Lord, O ye kindred of the Gentiles, bring unto the Lord glory and honor. Bring unto the Lord glory unto his name. Bring sacrifices and come into his courts. Adore ye the Lord in his holy court. Let all the earth be moved at his presence. Tell ye among the Gentiles that the Lord hath reigned. For he hath established the world, and it shall not be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity. Let the heavens rejoice, and let the earth be glad. Let the sea be moved, and the fullness thereof. The fields shall be joyful, and all things that are therein. Then shall all the trees of the woods rejoice before the face of the Lord, for he cometh to judge the earth. He shall judge the world with equity, and the peoples in his truth. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Amen.
Rejoice, O Virgin Mary, alone thou hast destroyed all heresies throughout the world. Now, when people think about the Hours of the Virgin, they think, oh, it's about Mary. And it's like, well, what did I just read?
A song about the Lord.
You
Yeah.
know? and we're going to go into that a little more, but the choice of the Psalms for the Marian offices is very ancient. There's like the oldest
Mhm.
liturgical references that we have. They're Carolingian, to go back to our humanist problem. They're 9th century. They include the same Psalms, and these are the Psalms that are used throughout the Middle Ages and into the present in recognizing her. So there's a choice from the 150 Psalms, although the Psalter itself, the Rosary itself, which is the feast that we're honoring today is
Mhm.
150 of them. So it's Mary's Psalter. But the Psalms that are chosen for her feast, clearly they're trying to say something about this is appropriate for thinking about the incarnation. So here we have Mary
Mhm.
destroys, O Virgin Mary, alone thou hast destroyed all heresies throughout the world. And the psalm talks about the gods of the Gentiles are devils, and the Lord made the heavens. So it's already it's saying there's these the destruction of heresies depends on recognizing the Lord. The destruction of heresies depends on understanding that the gods of the Gentiles are, in the Latin it says demons, right? And that all of these things come in his right. Praise and beauty are before him. Holiness and majesty are in his sanctuary. It's all about where he's found, in his court, right?
Yeah, she's
Bring
his court.
sacrifices and come into his courts. Adore ye the Lord in his holy court.
Yeah.
That the pairing of antiphons and psalms throughout the Marian office is reiterating over and over and over again. She's the place where he is seen.
Yeah. So she's his holy court.
She's his holy court. And it's the incarnation that destroys the heresies, but you don't see the incarnation
Yeah.
clearly unless you see
Yeah.
her as the place of his incarnation.
Yeah, you can't separate them. And I think at the Council of Ephesus, they concluded by praising Mary. And I think one of the exclamations was similar. You alone have destroyed all heresies. I think that comes from Saint Cyril of Alexandria, if I'm not mistaken.
All of these things are very ancient. I mean, and
Yeah,
that's why I got so excited about Barker, because I'm looking at these things in the 13th century and all these
yeah,
catalogs of titles, and oh, it's in the liturgy and the choice of the Psalms, and you keep going back, and then you find out, oh, guess what? It's in Germanus. Oh, it's in Proclus. Oh, it's in the oldest stories from Ethiopia and Syria. Oh, wait, it's in the New Testament. And then the primary claim saying the devotion to Mary is there from the beginning. Without her, you don't see Christ.
yeah,
It's just fundamental,
yeah,
right? And then
yeah,
the other things that Barker is trying to say about the lady and why the Christians are expecting the Lord in this way, then you are in a really difficult situation, because you have to say, well, Jesus was just some nut. And I'm really landing hard on this because I'm tired of hearing people say stupid stuff online. Either you think Jesus is just an idiot, a nut, a fantasist, right? Renan gets close to saying that in his Life of Jesus, right? Jesus was swept up in the enthusiasm of his followers for seeing himself as God, and he got kind of nutty.
sure.
Now, if you believe that, you're probably not Christian.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, the funny thing is, if you read the Dead Sea Scrolls and you read the prophecies of the Essenes, they actually, in their interpretation of one of the texts from Isaiah, I forget the exact verse, but it says, your Lord will come to Zion. They interpret that as Melchizedek. So Melchizedek is the Lord, Christ is the Lord, Christ is Melchizedek. He's the fulfillment. That's why he read that prophecy from Isaiah in the synagogue to say, look, this is me. I'm Melchizedek. I'm the return of the Lord. And that's why people sought to seize him and throw him over the cliff.
Right. Yeah. So I read John Bergsma's book on the
Hmm.
Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, goes
Yeah,
into that in detail if people are interested.
right. Yeah, I actually
Yeah.
met him at a conference. I actually got to meet him. I've had him on the podcast a few times. I got to meet him, and he signed
Good.
a book. It was absolutely wonderful to meet him. Great guy, very humble. But yeah, he does great work on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Definitely a go-to if you're interested in that subject.
Yeah, I met him because he was here in Chicago at a talk that he gave, and it's this, right? It's like, and this is what's interesting. So we gave you this title of Mary proves that Catholicism is right. That's what Bergsma and Scott Hahn are doing too, as former Presbyterians like me, right? It's the more you read the scriptures and see what the New Testament is doing and saying that they're fulfilling the scriptures, the more you realize that the
Yeah,
ancient tradition is consistent.
yeah. So I mean, like, if there's one takeaway from what we've been saying tonight, if there's one word that I want people to focus on with regards to Mary and why we honor her, the one key word is incarnation.
Right.
So if you're going to talk about the Lord, you got to talk about the lady through which he came. There's no separation. And this is from all eternity in the mind and plan of God. So from eternity, this has been the MO, if you will.
Right.
So this is why we honor Mary the way we do. And it's so interesting. in your book how you say, and you show the medievals had this devotion to Mary. They read her in the Old Testament just as frequently as they saw Christ, they saw Our Lady. You show, and Barker shows as well, that this isn't something that they cut out of whole cloth. Like, oh, there's scant evidence for Mary in the New Testament, so now we got to scramble and make up a bunch of lofty things about her, and we have to dig and find her in the Old Testament,
Right.
just to sort of play this kind of game, this word game. But they actually inherited, and it's crazy because you're talking about the 13th century. They inherited not just first century Judaism, they inherited the ancient Israelite religion with the mother of the Lord who anointed the king, who made the king God present with his people. I mean, the medieval Christians inherited this, and it's been passed on all the centuries without, basically, unscathed, and it's been there from the beginning, and it's still there now. It's incredible to think about.
That's the hardest thing for people to accept.
Yeah, how did it get so far and not be jumbled or messed up? I mean,
Right. And that's why I now tend to start with, you've got to understand what the 19th century did. And then you have to
I
understand,
see.
because it's like all of these hurdles that have been placed there to make it. I mean, we haven't, right? Since the 16th century, it's been jumbled up and nobody believes it anymore. But what I find interesting is, like, if you sort of the caricature of the Middle Ages is like, oh, it was tradition bound. And I'm like, okay, fine.
Hmm.
They're very consistent for centuries in their repertoire of images. Right now, the important thing to recognize is, I am not saying, although I poetically write in my book, they're carrying the ancient tradition. I'm not saying they know that, right? They say what they're doing is always, this is the way it's always been said, and I say yes, that's true. But
That's true.
what they're doing is faith, as it were, faithfully, religiously, they're reading the texts over and over and over again. And what we can see is it's like you start from the Gospels, and Mary's in there as praising the Lord, and saying, how can the mother of my Lord, Elizabeth saying, how can the mother of my,
Mhm.
they're reading the text, right?
Yeah.
And then the generation reads the text, and they're still doing it, right? And so if we don't believe in the actual existence of tradition, which I think modernity can't, right? We've
Mhm.
had all these ruptures, and some of them, Kiltz and I have talked about this a lot. They're media ruptures, right? There's the printing press, there's the electrical telegraph in the 19th century, there's movies and stuff, which I mentioned, in the 20th century, there's the digital world that we live in now, right? We've been through a lot of media ruptures
Mhm.
over the centuries. That from the New Testament to the early fathers, you go from scrolls to the fathers. So that's a bit of interruption, but it's not as big
Mhm.
as manuscript to print. It's interesting that we've lost. I think with each of those media ruptures, we lose an element of what was there before.
Mhm. And it seems the medieval Christians didn't miss a step. And it just goes to show you, we've preserved that ancient path because we have the same theology, and it's been there from day one. And that's why we honor Mary the way we honor her, not as a pagan deity or goddess. I mean, this was the religion of the Solomonic temple, the Melchizedek priesthood. It's all bound up with that. And so that's why we say what we say. And by the way, just so people are aware, when the hymnographers in Byzantium and Constantinople were writing these praises of Mary, they were in communion with Rome. I just wanted to
That
throw that
too,
out there.
yes,
Yes.
exactly. So all of this stuff that it's the popes, right? It's the Romanish. That's a 16th century slander of
Hmm.
the ancient tradition, pretending that the Roman tradition was, completely independent of, I don't know, absolutely every church in the world.
Right.
It's interesting. So I was thinking, there was something else you were saying there. They're in communion. Oh, right. I'm glad I invoked all the characters that I did at the beginning. So the movies and stuff create one kind of problem for us. I talked about the humanists and their invocation of these Carolingian copies of the classics as giving us the typefaces that we use. We believe those texts, right?
Hmm.
This is hilarious, right? It's like, oh, we've got, the ancient, Latin versions of X, Y, or Z. And it's like, yeah, some of them we only have in those monastic copies. So either you pretend that, in fact, the entire history of Rome is made up, by the medieval monks, which some people like doing. Like
Yeah.
pretending. It's like, oh yeah, all the entire history of Rome is made up by monks and, some kind of Umberto Eco sort of,
Yeah.
monastery. It's possible, right? But we don't tend to do that. We tend to believe that the Romans are absolutely historically real and Jesus is fantasy. It's an interesting little sleight of reality that people are willing to play. But I had another thought that I want to share with everyone,
Yeah,
because
please.
this is so people are dying in the Holy Land right now, and we pray for all of them, particularly the young men who have been slaughtered in their homes as soldiers. And it's happening at the end of the Feast of Sukkot, the Tabernacles, Yom Kippur, right? The booth is a very interesting image, particularly for our meditations here on Mary, because that's what she is.
Yeah.
If you have her, if you have her in the office and you have her in the lessons, I tend to say these in Latin, so I'm going to show off now, and which is actually, it's like the imperial language. It's, the reason that we have Christianity spread as fast as it does, quote, as fast as it does, is it's spreading around the empire, which has this, like English, right? It's the imperial language. So here we are in the imperial language. In omnibus requiem quaesivi, et in hereditate Domini morabor, tunc praecepit, et dixit mihi creator omnium, et qui creavit me requievit in tabernaculo meo, et dixit mihi. In Jacob inhabitat, in Israel hereditare, et in electis meis mitte radices, tu autem domine miserere nobis. I will now read it in our imperial language. In all these I sought rest, and I shall abide in the inheritance of the Lord. Then the Creator of all things commanded and said to me, and he that made me rested in my tabernacle. And he said to me, let thy dwelling be in Jacob, and thine inheritance in Israel, and take root in my chosen people. Do thou, Lord, have mercy on us. Thanks be to God. Now that from Ecclesiasticus 24, it's wisdom speaking and saying, in all things I sought rest, and I shall abide in you. Then the Creator of all things commanded and said to me, and he that made me rested in my tabernacle. Now that is very beautifully a description of he that made me rested in my tent, in my tabernacle, in my booth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
This is the last day of the Feast of Booths. We've had booths on campus all week, a number of them around. It's like, so the tabernacle throughout the Middle Ages, this is understood absolutely as an image of Mary, because she is the tabernacle is the desert shrine, like the temple, where the Lord becomes present through the cloud, through the fire. He rests in the tabernacle. This is where the ark is. Now, when Jesus is transfigured on the mountain, Peter suggests to them is, can we make you booths, right? Can we make you a booth, Jesus, and Moses and Elijah booths? So booths are where holiness is present.
Right.
The booths on campus this week have no ark.
Yeah.
And if you want to think about that, it's like we're not worrying about the monotheism of all of these. We're like, who has the Lord in his presence? Is it in Mecca? And their booth has the rock of Allah, right? Is it with the the synagogue now when the booths are empty? Or is it our Lord present in his nativity in the booth of the incarnation?
Yeah.
That Christians have booths. We have a feast of booths too, but we call them nativity scenes.
Yeah.
He rested in his tabernacle. And that, it's like when we're arguing, it's like you can argue philosophically about 1 and 3 and Trinity and stuff like that. That's why I steered you off of that, because that takes us into a place that most people aren't equipped to deal with. We are choosing between the booths. Right? Do you choose the empty booth? Do you choose the booth with the rock? Or do you choose the booth with the baby?
I like the way you put that. Yeah. And when you listen to all we've said tonight, I mean, if you're prayerful, if you're open-minded and open-hearted, hopefully the choice is clear. It's I think it was St. John Damascene, his homily on the Dormition, where he mentions that story about the Jewish priest who touches Mary's body, and his arm falls off, or his hand falls off, and is attached to the bier. And then Peter tells the priest to pray to Mary, and his hand will be restored. So, all this stuff about prayers to Mary being this like medieval Western invention,
Oh yeah,
just
it's not.
it's not there at all. I mean, the
It's an
Subtuum Praesidium.
Eastern tradition that the West takes up.
Yeah, exactly. And even the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, I think that was imported to England from the East, because before she was called Immaculate Conception, she was called Pre-Purified in the East, and it means the same thing.
Yes, and it's interesting for England. This is a whole nother stream, and Kilt and I have talked about this some, but England is the Anglo-Saxon England before the Norman conquest is very closely tied in its traditions to the East.
Interesting, yeah.
Partly because, partly largely because when Augustine goes to Augustine comes, he's sent to Canterbury, so he becomes Augustine of Canterbury. Gregory the Great sends him. Gregory had been in Constantinople, right? His commentaries on Job, he starts in Constantinople, and he sent, he's very revered in England, but he's also very revered in Spain. Spain has a very interesting iconography of Mary that's clearly very ancient, clearly looks exactly like stuff coming out of the Coptic tradition. But in the 7th century, there is a later bishop sent, again, there's Abbot Hadrian and Archbishop Theodore. And Hadrian is from North Africa, Theodore is from the East. And they bring with them to 7th century Anglo-Saxon England Greek. And it's clear that the Marian devotion in Anglo-Saxon England comes from the East. And so they have this feast of this conception, which when the Normans show up, they're like, we don't know that feast. And the English say, well, we've had it for centuries. And they have it because they had this very close tie in their education to the Syrian tradition.
Interesting. Yeah, a lot of this stuff is just lost on people, and it's not. I mean, it's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. It really is. It just
Well, it is truly mind-blowing because you have to blow your mind out, rearrange it, do a Chesterton flip,
and
then you realize you've been asking the question from the wrong direction. Because it's like, if you're asking it from the 19th century historical social realist perspective, Mary's a whore. And just keep saying that, because then you're like bluntly pointing people to say, do you believe that she conceived God by being overshadowed by the Holy Spirit? If yes, then other things are real. If no, then she lied to her husband.
Yeah.
Right. And it's interesting that people are so, as Protestants are so willing to say, don't you honor Mary? And it's like, well, what would that mean?
You can't honor her enough. Really,
if Jesus
you can't.
is the Christ, and the Christ is the Son of the Most High. And yeah.
So, all that we've been showing tonight again was just the title. Mary proves Catholicism is the true ancient path. I mean, that's we did it. When you get down to brass tacks, I mean, that's what it is. So, this stuff isn't medieval Western invention or flowery language or whatever you want to call it. It's ancient Israelite religion fulfilled to its full flowering and fulfillment with not only Jesus Christ, but the Mother of the Lord. So I recommend everybody pick up a copy of Rachel's book, Mary and the Art of Prayer. Let me just see if I can get it on the screen better so you can see it. There it is. I had to wait actually a long time because the hardcover was only available for a while and it was quite expensive, but I finally got my hands on a paperback copy.
And the thing is, the paperback copy has all the great praise on the back.
Yeah.
Of other people who've read it and said, yes. I mean, I think this is challenging, and I recognize it's challenging for you. Barker's work is challenging for people because you have to read through the layers
Yeah.
of why our understanding is what it is.
And you've the sources that you use in here, a lot of them weren't available in English until you've covered them. Is that correct? If I'm recalling correctly?
I spent as long as I did on the Richard of Saint Laurent because no, it's not. There's not. It's very long, and I'm more of an analyst than I am a translator. Although I'm working on a translation of a poem that I was working on my poetry for the past few years. The Conrad of Saxony is available in translation as Pseudo Bonaventure on the Mirror of Our Lady, the Speculum by Ave Maria. The Pseudo Albert's not translated. So yeah, so I try to give enough paraphrase of the text so that people had access to this material.
Yeah.
Richard of Saint Laurent people know, but they usually just footnote him and say, well, why would someone talk about Mary as this particular tree? Well, Richard of Saint Laurent says, and then you find in scholarship that's an interesting sort of thing. It's like, well, I got a footnote and he said that, and nobody asked why he said that. The sort of why is my obsession. It's like, well, why is it there? Well, and you look back and you keep seeing it, and as you've beautifully described right now, it keeps going back and it really is there. And once you find that out, you're just like, wait a minute, this is the ancient tradition. It's literally a tradition. They keep handing it on.
Yeah, it's been passed on faithfully.
Yeah.
And it remains. I mean, it's here in her feasts, in her office. It's just there. I mean, there's no getting around it. So if you want the ancient Israelite faith, you will come to the Catholic Church. I mean, hopefully, God willing.
We hope. And get the baby in the booth.
Yes. The one that's occupied. The one that's occupied.
The booth with the baby, rather than the booth with the rock or the booth with
empty. Just empty, right? We want the booth with the
tabernacle filled with the baby.
Yeah. It's interesting too when Peter says, I want to build 3 booths here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And at the end of the episode, Moses and Elijah disappear. And the father says, this is my son, listen to him, meaning it is my only begotten son who is filled with the divine presence. And these other guys vanish. Just means that Christ is really the fulcrum. And that's what the Father is trying to show the apostles on the Mount, that it's not these other guys. They converse with Christ. They're important. They point to him, but ultimately the reality is Christ, and you can't separate Christ from his mother. That's it.
Well, getting the frames are necessary, right? We can't see without a ground.
Yeah.
And one way of thinking about Mary, she's the ground against which Christ becomes visible, because I mean, there's this problem of, how does God become present in reality, present in like material incarnational reality, and that's in the art. That's what she's doing. She's always framing him.
Yeah, and it's one image I wanted to leave with was, in Barker and yourself bring this out, in Icons of the Annunciation, Mary is seen as having a spindle and having a red thread when the angel Gabriel comes to her. So she's actually tasked, and we get this from the Proto-Evangelium of James, she's actually tasked with weaving the temple veil. And as she's weaving this veil for the external temple, what's happening in her womb is she's weaving the priestly vestments or the curtain of our Lord to make him visible. So
that's the passage you read from Proclus is playing off of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's a beautiful image of the loom, and she's making, but the thread is for the temple veil, and so it's more problem of revelation. Yeah,
and she's the weaver, right? And one of the images of Lady Wisdom is the weaver who holds creation together, and she holds creation together in her womb by weaving those threads and bringing the Lord into the world. It's just even the way she goes on the third step of the temple and plays before the high priest. The high priest obviously is the presence of the Lord, and in Proverbs it says the lady, or plays and delights before her maker. So it's just, oh man, it's just incredible.
I know, it's just like you get chills, but what we needed to do it slowly in steps, because simply telling people that, they won't understand why it's actually real.
Yeah, we need to frame it first.
We need to frame it first.
Frame it, yeah.
The Marian problem.
Right. Well, I just want to thank you, Rachel, for this is actually one of my longest streams. I think it actually might be my longest stream. My second longest was with Larry Chapp, and that was
Mm.
about 2 years ago when we discussed the problem of radical traditionalism in the church. But I think this has now overtaken that as my longest stream, and very fitting to give honor to Our Lady. Of course, we can't honor her enough on the feast of Our Lady of Victory / Our Lady of the Rosary. So I want everyone to go and get a copy of Rachel's book, Mary and the Art of Prayer. Please support her in what she's doing. She's just amazing. I mean, you've heard her explicate everything and break it down. Her book is indispensable. And along with that, because she uses Barker as a frame, there's that word again, you want to pick up Margaret Barker's works, especially since she's working on a 3-part series. The first one was Mother of the Lord, Volume 1, The Lady in the Temple. Now it is Volume 2, The Great Lady, Restoring Her Story. And I think Volume 3 she'll be talking about Lead Books from the Jordan, which talk about the Theotokos and the Lady as the God-bearer before the revelation of Jesus Christ. So we have some anticipatory typology going on there. So we're going to be on the lookout for that. So guys, before I close out the show, I just wanted to thank you all for joining in the chat and having some insightful comments and questions. And Rachel, did you have any concluding thoughts before we end tonight?
Well, we do pray for those in Israel who are in Gaza, who are in conflict now, and particularly for the way they're being used to fight worldly battles, much as I fear the Jews were in 70 AD when the Romans took them over and destroyed that temple.
Yeah, Our Lady, pray for them, please.
Our
Pray
Lady
for their
pray for them.
souls. And I just want to give a big shout out to Kilts because I'm really honored that she would join this stream. And she said, "Amazing stream, Hail Miriam." I just I've never had any interaction with her, and I mean, we talked before about me coming on one of your streams and maybe giving my testimony, which I'm still interested in doing. If you guys would be so kind to have me one day, that would be wonderful. But I'm just so honored that she came and watched the stream, and she thinks highly of it, and she had her tobacco going as well. So that's very cool.
The
Yes.
incense is rising.
Yeah, the incense is mine's gone out. I have a little bit left. I'm
Okay.
gonna light after we end here. But guys, you've been tuned into Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick. This was episode 98. Mary proves Catholicism is the true ancient path with Rachel Fulton Brown. So with that, guys, I just want to say God bless and thank you, Rachel. I love to have you on again, and my Mac is out of power almost, so
We've used it up.
Perfect time, all that power. Okay, so I'm gonna end the broadcast in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, I pulled